is that in an informal discussion, you kind of take information, right? And you say, well, that's interesting, right? And, maybe we can do something with this. And, we sort of move on to our regular things. Whereas with the ceremony and, when we had these kind of discussions traditionally, this was, it involved a whole lot of things like purification ceremonies, and these things often went on for days. So we treated our spirituality very seriously. And so when you had those discussions, it was really involving your whole being, so to speak. And, this was something which, wasn't just taking information, but rather it was a real commitment to take it to heart and to make change and that type of thing. So I just wanted to just make that point. And I will say a brief prayer just in the way of beginning this. So, Creator, thank you for the gifts of creation. Thank you for these gifts which we are on having a physical experience in order to learn from.
Okay.
Please,
as we meet for life,
please remind us about our responsibilities to be stewards and caretakers of the environment. For these are the gifts which will help to sustain us in future generations. In the name of all our relations. Okay. So you'll note at the end of the prayer, I did mention all of our relations because, again, in our tradition, we actually considered all created beings to be related spiritually. And so, it was that's kind of like a way of acknowledging our position in terms of the world. So I will start off by, first of all, talking about what I consider to be the foundations of our relationship to the environment and therefore food sustainability. So this whole area, as I would argue, or I would say that all of our knowledge rests on, is based on our spirituality. And so we believe that we are spirit beings who have been given permission to experience a physical life in the form of these physical bodies, and that like as the elders have told me, we ask permission to experience this in order to learn. And so in terms of doing this, the thing that we are supposed to be learning is about appropriate relationships. And so, the relationships, the whole question of relationships, not just between each other as human beings, but also relationship with what I call the natural world, as well as the spirit world. These are all central to, to our preoccupations. And, when European explorers came here, they often used to wonder, what on earth are these people doing? Because they didn't see us, working 9 to 5, so to speak, and, doing all kinds of things that Europeans are accustomed to seeing, like, for example, having big institutions and jobs and that type of thing. And the reason I say that is because our primary preoccupation was based upon spirituality, and it was based upon what we understood as what we do call the original instructions. And so even in our education systems, for example, we didn't teach like the three R's, reading, arithmetic, and writing and that type of thing, but rather we taught about spiritual values. There's what we call the grandfather, the 7 grandfather laws, which are also known as the 7 values or 7 virtues. And those in a nutshell are humility, honesty, courage, respect, sharing. There's wisdom. I might be forgetting one other one, but love. Yeah, that's the other one. So these were the primary objectives of our learning experience, and so that's why when explorers came here, they said, well, all these people seem to be doing is sitting around and doing what was perceived as senseless ceremonies and doing things like drumming and dancing, that type of thing. So they didn't understand the whole purpose of our culture and our whole ideological and sort of social orientation, cultural orientation. And, I would also point out that they say that modern humans have been around for 200,000 years. And that I also point out that the culture of these indigenous people is essentially indigenous culture. And, like the indigenous peoples who continue to survive have carried on this type of ideology, this whole idea of humans not being central to nature, but rather being dependent on nature and having a sacred purpose for living. These ideas, I say, have been around since the dawn of modern humanity 200,000 years ago. And so, they created a situation in which we lived in harmony with the natural environment and with each other. And that, the system which we experience today, which I have summarized as civilization, came about basically as a choice in terms of our human way of relating to the world. It was a deliberate choice to abandon these original, what I call these original values, which, as I mentioned, if you go around the world to see any of the existing indigenous cultures, you'll find that they all basically have the same approach, to their place in the world. And so the issue, as I see it, has been the abandonment of this original indigenous ideology and culture which existed all over the world, and its gradual, I guess you might say, subjugation by and replacement by civilization. And I can get more into this, but let me go back to what I consider to be the spiritual foundation. So, we saw ourselves as being here at the permission of the Creator, and we had responsibilities to be stewards of the environment and to treat all created things as having their own spirit and their purpose for being, and that we didn't have a right to dominate or exploit them, but rather we were to nurture them. And it's also said, for example, that elders often point out that humans are late arrivals and we are the most dependent on the rest of creation. So there are other things which this entails. I mentioned, for example, this whole idea about the recognition of the spirit in other created beings, for example, animals and plants, and so that we did have a relationship with animals and plants. How did we develop that relationship? And we took a whole different approach to it. We didn't, although we had our own sort of concepts of science, these concepts were based upon a spiritual relationship with these plants and animals. And so, of course, we observed the plants and animals, but even more significantly, we treated them as spiritual beings, and we also believe that that we were able to connect with them in terms of ceremony. So it's interesting that you will find even in historical sources that and in terms of testimonies of modern elders that the way in which they developed and learned about plants, for example, in South America and all over Turtle Island, places like that, that a lot of these so-called discoveries of the qualities of plants, for example, medicinal qualities, or the development of edible foods, which were things that were developed extensively in the Americas. For example, they say that in the Americas we probably developed more edible food varieties than anywhere else in the world. And how did we do this? Like I say, certainly we observed, but the most fundamental practice was ceremony. And that it's said that, for example, we could unlock the secrets of the plants through these ceremonies by directly communicating with them. And they would, if we needed them, they would reveal our place, their place, where we could locate them. They could also reveal the properties. So, this is a very strange way to approach things in terms of sort of like a materialistic, secular Western philosophy. It almost, makes zero sense, but, I can say myself that I've experienced ceremony and experienced this phenomenon of being able to, receive information, which, is, it's difficult to explain how it's received, but it's simply received in a way which is what you might call a non-rational process, right? In other words, you don't know exactly how this information was received, except that it was received and that it had meaning. So same thing with animals. We believed again that they had spirits. We believed that we related to them. We believed that we could communicate with them in ceremony using protocols, and that this led to a relationship between humans and animals, in which in return for the respect we would give them. For example, when we hunted, we would leave an offering, and we would thank the spirit of the animal so that they would, be more abundant for us, and for future generations. And it's said, for example, that through this type of method, that even in this area, that the elders did and continue to say that the natural environment provided all kinds of for example, herbal remedies, that almost every plant had some sort of use, and that it sort of in fact served as some sort of pharmacy. And again, this was a system which worked for us. It fit in terms of our cultural and spiritual relationship to the land and to these to these other beings, which again, as I mentioned, we considered we had a sacred relationship. It wasn't just a simple commercial relationship of cultivating and harvesting, for example, for profit. So so it's a whole different, it's a whole different type of thing. And I mean, I'm pointing this out because, Marla did mention, and it's mentioned on your website, about this thing about a cultural and spiritual revolution. And, a lot of people don't understand the depth of differences that exist between, our cultural practices and our spiritual practices, and what, what kind of came here, from Europe, and, with the settlers and colonizers. And so, I mean, I'm obviously, not suggesting that people can go all of a sudden go back 100 years or go back to the same kind of practices. But what I'm saying is that, we need to acknowledge that there was a much different mentality, right? And it was based not on rationalism and secularism, but rather it was based on a very in-depth and a very serious and meaningful spiritual relationship that Indigenous people had with the land. And so, these are really, very profound questions of cultural and spiritual change, which we need to ponder. And I guess, the only other thing I would say is that, our approach to, these things was life-sustaining. It was life-enhancing because, it was our practice not to interfere with, with these plants and animals, but rather it was to make sure that they were able to thrive. And, this is why we didn't exploit the natural resources. We simply allowed them to flourish. And we did whatever we can to enable them to multiply, so that they would be available in even greater numbers for future generations. And so, it was a simple economic and natural resource policy, but it also reflected our belief that, we didn't have the right to control and exploit these resources, but we did have a right to, or we did have responsibility to be stewards. And by being stewards, we would be relatively assured, I guess you might say, of the abundance of life-sustaining resources for ourselves and for future generations. Which doesn't mean that things, could sometimes be difficult. There could be shortages and that type of thing, but we always resorted to our spirituality to answer these questions, and we always shared. It was part of the laws of our people that we could not hoard or take a selfish approach to things. Everything had to be shared, and it's also interesting that the further back we look in history, and like I've as part of the process of doing my research, I've gone back to look at European history, and of course, what I found in Europe was that at one time it was full of Indigenous people, and there are still some remnants of Indigenous peoples, Celtic, and for example, the Sami people, and there's Basques and other people that are still remnants of people who still are connected to their spirituality and their land. But many of these systems that we're used to now are just recent. For example, the whole question of private property, of commodification of resources, of banking systems, and boundaries, and these type of things. These things are only a couple of centuries old, really. And, a lot of them, interestingly enough, really derived around the time in which European colonialists were spreading around the world, and they basically were, usurping and taking control over Indigenous lands. So it's an interesting phenomenon to watch. But, even in Europe, there was an extensive concept of commons, where the ordinary person, had the right to go and exploit the resources of the land, whether it was plants or animals. And so, that was the fundamental approach as well in the Americas and with Indigenous peoples. There were, although there were protocols that needed to be followed. It wasn't just a free-for-all. So, for example, if you were entering the lands of another group, there were certain protocols that you had to follow. And I often point out that, we didn't need passports, but, we had the equivalent of passports, which basically were ceremonies. And so when you went into another group's land, the first thing you had to do was to have the ceremony. And, in this area and with most cultures in the Americas, it's the pipe ceremony. And, the pipe ceremony is, it's also been referred to as the ceremony of adoption, in which, in a sacred setting, you basically confirm that you share the same spiritual and cultural values as the group that you're, whose territory you're entering. And so once that's established, then you had the freedom to use the commons for, your needs, whether it's hunting or fishing or gathering plants or whatever. And that whole approach to the environment and stuff like that, was the kind of thing that existed prior to privatization and, like our current forms of agriculture and, mass production and, production of animals and the whole market economy and the need to produce these things and harvest them and market them in order for us to survive. So, these modern systems are very recent, and I think it's a legitimate question to ask how sustainable they are in the long term. The indigenous systems, I think, clearly have been sustainable for centuries and millennia. I would argue that they have been an effective way of humans living in harmony with the environment for 200,000 years, right? And in contrast, I would point out that our modern systems are very recent, and also a thing which a lot of people don't appreciate is that non-Indigenous peoples have only been the majority of world population for about the last 200 years, since about the 1820s. And so, it was a slow spread of civilization, and it wasn't necessarily something that was willingly embraced. It was generally done through some sort of a force, whether it was displacement, sometimes by force with colonial authorities coming in and taking over the land, or whether it was the necessity of Indigenous peoples to become tied into the market economy in order to access, for example, in this area, things like the need to trap furs and to purchase, metal technology and guns and that type of thing was a motivating factor, which sort of caused Indigenous people to become involved with the market economy. And this was all at the expense of their traditional economy and at the expense of, their normal cultural and spiritual relationship with the animals and plants. So that's why, for example, when Europeans came here, they found an abundance of fish in the oceans, and it said that you could dip a basket in the ocean, come up with a basket of fish, or there was billions of passenger pigeons in the east. They were slow flying, and they were nutritious, and so it didn't take long for these pigeons to be exterminated through the hunting and the exploitation of that resource by settlers and colonists. And the same thing, of course, with the bison in the West. And so fortunately, the bison are not totally extinct. So Indigenous peoples had a number of practical ways of assisting the environment. For example, there's things like deliberate burning of grasslands or forests in order to bring about renewal. There's also, for example, practices in the Amazon where the soil of the Amazon is originally not very good soil. And it was actually through the deliberate practices of Indigenous peoples over thousands of years to enrich the soil using, for example, ash and fish remains and different kinds of things to enrich that soil, which has enabled it to achieve the, the ability to sustain the diversity that it currently does. There, of course, I think was also other reasons why we had food sustainability. Part of it was because of our practices of ensuring balance between natural populations, what we call a population that's in balance with nature, versus what's occurring today. And I point out that there's essentially sort of two approaches to what I would call optimum population. The first approach would be what I would call an Indigenous approach, which is not to overutilize or to overstress the resources. And this was practiced in Central America. For example, with the groups like the Mayans, for example. People often wonder about the abandonment of urban centers, and in my discussion with Mayan scholars, they point out that their society lived according to cycles, and that after a certain cycle, they believed that it was time for renewal, and as part of this renewal involved, like the essentially the rebuilding of society, and also, sort of a in many cases a renewed relationship with the environment, where environments that had reached I guess the limit of their use would be they would move on to another location. And as opposed to that, of course, we have the modern interpretation of optimum population, which is essentially whatever the traffic can bear in terms of our current economic and technological systems. And so, you have banks that are capable of financing extensive developments, whether it's urban developments spreading into lands and creating mines and creating farms and creating transportation industries and so on and so forth. And all this, of course, is based on a financial system which is really totally artificial and separate from the environment. And so you do get a case where under this type of scenario, you can theoretically, and I guess practically, maintain a population of 8, 9, 10 billion people. But the question, of course, remains is how sustainable is that, especially when you're not just looking over like a 5-year scenario or a 10-year scenario or a 100-year scenario, but you're actually looking over, let's say, 1,000 years or 10,000 years. And one of the things which I often point out to my students is that in our hubris, we think that we're so clever that we will be able to last forever. But I point out that the species that are closest to us, like the simians, that type of thing, are expected to be around for 1 million years. And so we've been around for 200,000 years. That just leaves another 800,000 years to go, right? So, where is our social and economic and our cultural policy, right, for surviving for another 800,000 years? So, I will just point out this book here, which I've got, is the one that Marla was referring to. That just came out earlier this year. And it's actually the third. I'm trying to get it. There you go. It's actually the third. It's actually part of a trilogy. And this one deals with essentially Indigenous spirituality and wisdom in the future. I had actually written the first book on Indigenous spirituality, which is called The Knowledge Seeker, Embracing Indigenous Spirituality. This came out in 2016. And what I was doing here with the encouragement of elders was to talk about Indigenous spirituality as a system, and that it is a viable system, which there was really nothing wrong with it except that it didn't serve the purposes, I guess you might say, of the kind of civilization that came in to replace indigenous peoples. I was asked a lot of questions about what I wrote. Some people were skeptical about what I wrote, so I decided to write the second book, which is called Loss of Indigenous Eden and the Fall of Spirituality, which came out in 2020. And basically, this book went back and looked in history to see what happened to Indigenous peoples, Indigenous spirituality. And, I referred to the world that existed of Indigenous people. I call it Indigenous Eden, because it was a situation in which people were in harmony with the environment and with their spirituality. And in this book, I identified civilization as the point at which the common understanding between people's sort of parted ways, with Indigenous people having one sort of mentality and approach and ideology, as opposed to civilization, which basically placed humans at as the central purpose of creation, and sort of enable them to exploit the environment, dominate the environment, primarily for the purposes of wealth and power. So, there's the food system vision network. I think has a big challenge in terms of trying to bring about this type of more sustainable system in the province. And it also has a challenge, I think, in terms of what you might call a spiritual and cultural evolution. I don't want to minimize the challenges involved. These are issues which I think even in our own Indigenous communities we grapple with. in terms of the history of our communities, we've had what you call, subdivision of our lands and individualization of for example, the farming and production operations. Our own farmers have to produce produce for sale. And yet we do have some family and communal operations in some communities. But again, these are not easy things to do, especially in terms of having to, survive within, like the market economy that we're living in. Yeah, it's, I think, this whole issue, which you allowed me to speak about, is something I think which, is a question of reconciliation. And I think it does raise profound issues. And I appreciate that you've invited me here to speak, and I'm more than happy to try and answer any questions that you might have. So with that, Marla, I'll turn it back to you.
Turn myself on. Perfect. Thank you so much, Blair, for that. And I appreciate at the beginning your explanation of protocol, because I'm definitely here to learn with humility. So thank you for that. I have a question for you, and I'll take questions, obviously, from anybody. Just put your hand up or put something into the chat or take yourself off mute. But in your book, you talk about, ecolization,
right,
or civilization. Could you talk about that for just a little bit?
Yeah. So what happened there basically is that, when you go to university, or when I went to university for that matter, the thing that you basically learn is that civilization is the best thing that's ever been created. It's referred to as man's greatest achievement. And, if you look at any book, at the definition of civilization, it basically says that this is the point at which humans decided to, sort of confront and take over and dominate nature, so that in many ways is kind of portrayed as the beginning of anything that's worthwhile studying. And of course, we get into all of these things like the achievements of the Persians and the achievements of the Greeks and the Romans, and then later the Holy Roman Empire. And, it goes on and on into the so-called great civilizations. And you've got, the heroes such as, Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great and so on and so forth. And so what you're basically presented with is this notion that, again, civilization is the greatest achievement of humankind, and it's the only thing that's ever really deserved any attention. And so anything having to do with Indigenous people or anything before that is kind of, it's kind of like considered to be chopped liver, right? It's kind of like not worth. It's not worth talking about because it doesn't. I guess it doesn't make sense. In terms of secularism, a lot of people just kind of, as soon as you mention spirituality and like that, it's kind of, becomes a blank slate in terms of a lot of people. But what I say is that, Indigenous people did have their own intelligence. They had their own way of relating to the world. They had their own systems and approaches, and but it wasn't recognized, or it wasn't understood by those people who were pursuing a sort of a civilization model. And so what I had to do, because in academia they still do basically say that Indigenous peoples were simply on the first step towards civilization. It's kind of like a linear approach where they say we were incipient civilizations, and there's often reference to, for example, Aztecs and Incas and Mayans as civilization, as being civilizations, and they're not, because their actions and developments very much corresponded to their spiritual beliefs. They were, for example, there were no money systems in the Americas, right? So how are these people doing things, right? And if you look at history, you'll find that their motives are based upon, like their spiritual beliefs and their spiritual systems. So basically, what people who say that that Indigenous people had no way of knowing, of relating to the world, didn't have an intellectual system or whatever, a cultural system, and we're simply stupid, empty people, who were simply going to eventually evolve into civilizations. I simply say that we did, and I created that term equalization as a way of saying this was our way of understanding that we were to live in balance with nature. We didn't have the right to dominate it or exploit it. And if we I'm not saying we were perfect, but we did make mistakes. But we had those tools. We had the spiritual tools. We had the ceremonies to help us get back on the right path. We had the values and our knowledge, which helped us to restore that balance and what I call a culture of life. And so the term equalization is basically used as a counterpoint to civilization, because right now there isn't really any alternative or sort of opposing sort of term, right, which can say, well, we had this is what we had, right, and it wasn't called civilization. And that's the problem, is that scholars still continue to refer to Indigenous societies as civilizations, right? And as soon as we can build something or create something, we're called a civilization. And what I describe civilization as is basically it's a human-centered enterprise, which is based on the pursuit of wealth and power, and that wasn't our approach at all. Our approach was a spiritual approach in harmony with our environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, that's one of for me, that was like a shift, like a paradigm shifting, thought shifting moment for me, right? And to articulate it in the way that you did, was very helpful. And then for me, it's like, and now what? Like, what's the action? And it's, there's many hundreds of millions of steps, I think, between now and, being able to figure out some sort of balance or a different way of being on this earth. Or I think she's going to take care of that for us, but that's my own belief.
That's the big question, right? That's the girl in the room, if you want to, so to speak, right? And reconciliation efforts are just kind of scratching the surface, and but I mean, if we're concerned about future generations, I think we need to really start seriously thinking about what we're going to do. And we need to think on a much broader time scale, right? Who's thinking 10,000 years from now or 100,000 years from now? And so I think, what I tell people is, number one, we need to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples exist, and that, we had our ways, and that our ways were not primitive, that they actually still make sense, and they have value, they have intrinsic value. And, but it's interesting that if you, let's say if you go to Google and you sort of ask, well, what's the solution for the future, right? You usually come up with usually the ones I've seen, there's usually two options or two ways it's going to go. One is anarchy, right? Everything's got to fall apart and then you rebuild it. And the other one is artificial intelligence, right? Just hand all the job over to some supercomputer, right? And they'll run everything for us, right? But whoever talks about going back and rediscovering the Indigenous wisdom as the solution, whoever talks about that, nobody talks about it, right? And I think it's part of the product, I think, of the intellectual and ideological warfare that's been waged on Indigenous peoples, like the whole discounting and devaluing our way of knowing and our knowledge. And it's because it doesn't serve the purposes of our current form of the way we're living, right? It doesn't encourage the exploitation of resources. It doesn't encourage, like our divorce from nature and all that type of stuff, right? And there's such a poor understanding of what spirituality is about that people almost they really become disconnected from it. But I do point out that the results of spirituality are all around us. When you have an unspiritual way of living, this is the kind of chaos and despair and social dysfunction and mental illness and crime and substance abuse. This is the result of an unspiritual way of living.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree. So there's a question in the chat from Craig. He asks, when looking at the TRC and UNDRIP regarding food sovereignty, what is your vision of returning to the traditional cultural and ceremonies of the past as a way to provide services?
CRC is which? Sorry, I'm not sure.
I think he's maybe, Craig, do you want to come off mute and ask your question? That's probably better than me trying to interpret it, if you don't mind, or if you're able to. Maybe you're not able to. Oh,
I don't
awesome.
mind. Yeah.
Thank you.
For me, I got to do some work through UNDRIP and the TRC, and the concept of food sovereignty was well discussed. Mm-hmm. How the people inherently took care of each other, how everybody kind of had a role to play, but nobody went without. And so if we look at the traditional teachings of food sovereignty, how could we apply that in today's traditional services, say like the food bank systems? How could we better apply the traditional teachings to today's services?
Well, that's a big question. Yeah, so I mean, we're caught up in a system which has become very difficult, right? Indigenous people are caught up in the system, and we don't have the control. Like we've got very minimal control over these things. What we do have is our teachings, which have been preserved by our elders, which kind of provide, I guess you might say, sort of a guiding light for us, right, as to how it was done and how it was successful and how potentially it could be reincorporated to some extent. So the problem, of course, is that the fundamentals are wrong, right? We don't have systems which are based and which really practice sharing, so yeah, it's what can I say? I think that people can certainly benefit from learning more about Indigenous spiritual philosophy and about Indigenous practices of sharing, for example, and of making sure that there was, adequate food resources that were available for everybody, that was shared and that was, abundant and that type of thing. It's a whole different ballgame when you come to something, let's say, with a food bank or even a community. When you don't have those systems in place, you don't have everybody necessarily on the same page, looking at the same kind of approach to things. And so, it seems these days, if we want to do everything, the first thing that people say is, well, where's the money? And that's another conundrum. Back in traditional societies, that was done through the will of the people, right? Based on the resources that they were able to get, and they made sure that everybody's needs were met. So it's not an easy question, but I mean, it certainly doesn't hurt to go back and study the principles upon which we practice things. And I often say that mainstream society certainly has a lot to learn from us as well in terms of how do we move forward. And I'm not claiming this is anything easy, because in many ways it does entail the undoing of of a lot of the systems which we take for granted. But don't people have agency? I mean, people can do whatever they want to do if they have the will to get along. They don't necessarily have to have money, but this is something that's been imposed upon us by the system. The same thing with the animals and plants are quite happy to grow in nature and as part of the commons, right? And theoretically, it's it should be possible for people to go and take whatever they need from the commons, right? To take whatever. But again, the thing is that we've been sort of dragged yelling and screaming in a way into this system, and we can see the concerns of it. We can see the concerns of it from point of view of our culture in terms of, questions of sustainability of the natural world, like the ability to provide for future generations, and you would think that it would be obviously apparent to, settlers as well, what's happening to the natural environment, right? Like the fact that, 90% of large game animals have disappeared, sometimes 95%. And a lot of that has been over even the last 50 years or so. Like the pollution of the waters, the damaging of forests, the disappearance of bird species and insects and so on and so forth. And, what's the solution to these? Well, I think, when we talk about the need for a social, spiritual and cultural revolution, that's probably the answer. The answer is not going to be throwing more money at it or creating more scientists, like we didn't need money or we didn't need scientists because, we follow the creator's original instructions. And as long as we did that, we knew things would be fine, all of the need for these scientists and banks and stuff like that. That's many ways it appears to be a solution, and I'm sure it will be it probably is a short-term solution, but is it a long-term sustainable solution? Right. And I don't see any policymakers talking about that. Everybody's talking about what interest rate is there going to be, is there going to be enough to create employment and, house new immigrants and so on and so forth. And, where are we going to find the money to, fund the weapons we need to, to fend off potential aggressors and so on and so forth. And so, that's a system which has been created by I call it the civilizational system that's been brought over here, which has been imposed upon us. And, we take it for granted. We believe that, this is the system we're stuck in, and we believe that there's not much we can do about it. But, at the same time, I really kind of think that there are people in the mainstream who realize that this is wrong, but they don't really know what to do about it either. And, it's, our elders talk about a reckoning, right? Because I think they can see that, it's violating what we understand as our natural laws, right? And there are going to be consequences. These are not things that simply can continue. It's a part of human hubris to think that we can control all of this.
And sorry, something that I just thought of is also we act as if our current economic rules and institutions are natural. Yep. But they're just made up. We just made them. Well, yep. We just made them up. We can change it in a heartbeat. Yep. Like it's not, it's challenging because it means that the people who hold wealth and power now probably won't if we actually changed how we thought about our world, right? And shifted that. But, and that's what I find not frustrating, but I guess it's easy to be, sort of intellectually interested in that. It's like, but people are so bought into and so, it's not even visible, right? It's just considered so much a part of who we are as anyway. So I think, so for me, that gives me a bit of hope. It's like, we can do this differently. Yeah. We just need to get enough people to decide to.
Yeah. Well, for example, our money system, I know when I was doing research on that, I got a book, I think it was called Money by Goldstein, but the subtitle was a made up thing, right? So, it's artificial for sure. And so, in that last book, I also had a chapter on natural versus artificial. And so, like, our human systems are essentially artificial, and they're here essentially to to serve our needs, right? And they are, they're in many ways harmful to the natural system. And so, again, like you say, people take these things for granted, but they're not. This is just look at how fast this whole business of vehicles, gas-powered vehicles, is changing, right? That's only been around for a little over 100 years, and now they're talking about phasing it out, right? That's how fast that's changed. And I know even in my lifetime, I remember when I was a kid, like people used to live, people lived in log shacks, right, without electricity or radio or television. And, you could go outside and, you'd find a lake without pollution. You could drink the groundwater, and, you'd see lots of animals around and stuff like that. Could be trapped and hunted. But that's only in my lifetime. That's like in the 1950s, So, things like computers, we now think that, you can hardly live without a computer, right? And that's only been around for, like a decade or two. And so how much is it going to change in the future, right? I mean, we're in a very rapid, period of change. And, I guess the thing is, there's a change. There's a thing which ecologists like to say, which is the greatest threat to a species longevity is change, especially rapid change.
So there's a couple of more questions. So Noella asks, what advice do you have for our youth to act upon for 7 generations into the future for food scarcity?
Yeah, well, it's I sometimes wonder about our dependence on these grocery chains, and like the corporations that control the food system. They seem to provide us with such a reliable food system and variety of brands, but fundamentally they control it, right? There's a very small number of people who control it, and sometimes I watch these. They have these shows about the factories that produce these goods, right? And they have these huge machines that process this food and package it, and then they send it out, distribute it all over the world, and that's where we're getting our food from, right? And it's basically it's a money system. These corporations are making immense amounts of money, and they have this entire economic structure of employment and distribution and advertising and all that kind of stuff and thing. But again, that itself is very recent. When I was a kid, a lot of people were still going to a local grocery store and buying local produce. And so again, the question becomes, how sustainable is that? It would appear to me that there are potential problems where those corporations could become non-functional, right? And those distribution systems can no longer be functional. And so what happens? And at that point, are people able to go to the source, which is survived, which has sustained people for I would say up until the last couple of centuries, for 199,000 years, which was the commons, right? The like the ability to go to natural sources. Not only that, but to know where to go, to know what to pick, to know how to hunt. Do kids these days, will they know how to do that? Even more in the future, will they know how to do that, right? And I think that is a real concern, especially if we start to have problems, right, with this what essentially is an artificial system, right? And it's basically the fuel essentially is money, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's a question for society. And but it's not a question that's going to necessarily be answered by those who are running the system, because they're the ones who are profiting off it, right? Including, say, politicians, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's like turkeys voting for Christmas. It's like It's not in once anyway. Yeah, no, for sure. Thank you for that, Blair. There's another comment from Craig. Thank you, Craig. It says, we are finding in implementing some of these natural laws around sharing food sovereignty and access to ceremony, the significant barriers that they encounter by the current system. It is navigating these barriers of access to the natural laws that impede services and leads to many of the social determinants of health. Collectively, is there a group addressing this at the federal level? Are you?
Yeah, yeah. I know I got a request from a federal official a couple of weeks ago asking about Indigenous sort of input in terms of culture and spirituality in the health system, and my response was. That elders have tried to give advice, but it's not really, hasn't really gotten any traction, and I'm sure it's like that in most places that any advice that we have to offer is it doesn't really get much traction, and I think a lot of these government agencies are probably looking at, how can we create solutions within our existing framework, right? So, in other words, how can we fund it? How can we hire a consultant to do a study of it, and can we kind of make it somehow feasible, whether it's economically or whatever, and so. I've argued that in order to bring about real change, there's a couple things that need to happen. Number one, the mainstream needs to understand better, like what our culture and our values are about. And, this needs to be disseminated more in the education system. And, policymakers certainly wouldn't hurt from learning more about this. Apart from that, we need allies. We need people in positions of power, whether they're politicians or, people like the people that Craig was referring to, and who sit in government positions and stuff like that, who are allies, who actually understand and appreciate and really believe in, in the things that we have to offer, and that they can use those positions to help bring about change. Because as Indigenous peoples, we have very few levers of power ourselves, right? It is one thing to understand there's a different way, and it's a whole different question about how you can implement it. But I guess we need to start somewhere, and it's going to be a real challenge, I think.
Yes, thank you. And I was thinking, this is going out to everybody, maybe thinking about or putting into the chat. It's sort of the question that that Craig asked earlier about, how do you change the current services that we're providing, knowing what we know, basically, or learning what we're learning about different ways, ways of being. And, I really, one of the things that I'm hoping that we can do from this is like, what is one thing that we could, or I could, or other people on the call will do to just take that one step, right? To what and this isn't necessarily a question for you, Blair, but I would love to hear your response. But it's like, what can, so that we don't feel that we can't do something,
Yeah.
that is also big. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I get that question, from people, and one of the things I usually say is, one of the things I often tell people is, have a bit of humility, right? Which means being open to actually hear and understand that Indigenous peoples have something to say, and the whole thing about ceremony is in our culture is an important vehicle, because in our culture, when you really seriously want to do something, it becomes a ceremonial question. It's not just a question of sitting down and having a casual chat, because even with elders, like a lot of people sometimes wonder why elders don't offer a lot, right? It's because they distinguish between what's an informal chat and what is a serious, like a conversation with, which goes further than just sort of like a banter of some sort, right? And so, I would say that people need to be open to ceremony, whether it's like a cleansing ceremony, like a sweet grass ceremony or a pipe ceremony. The problem, of course, is that a lot of people don't understand it, right? They wonder what's this about, right? And that's the problem, is that the mindset is different, right? A lot of non-Indigenous people want to say, well, let's just get to the point, right? Let's just have a conversation and make those points, right?
Yeah.
It's different. You see, we believe that there's a higher level of understanding, a higher level from just like what we call the rational mind, right? Which is takes in information and processes it and acts on it. Because the problem, of course, is that fundamentally it's a non-spiritual process. It doesn't really take into account a sense of who we are as spiritual beings. It doesn't take into account our responsibility to each other and to like the environment, our plant and animal beings and stuff like that. I sometimes say I'd love to take all of these so-called leaders at the United Nations and I'd like to put them through 4 days of ceremonies and let them go through purification ceremonies, sweat ceremonies, let them listen to elders talk about what our purpose for living is and what our spiritual values should be, of respect and humility and honesty and that type of thing. Let them go through a spiritual process before they start talking to each other about, who's got the most money or who's got the most biggest armies or whatever, and all that type of thing, right?
Yeah, and who's deserving and who isn't.
Yeah.
That's part of that conversation. And Craig's put a suggestion: attend a sweat or ceremony with your local Indigenous peoples be intentional and mindful of the local protocols.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, hi.
Hi, this is Linda Young. I'm butting in
Linda.
because I'm in the car and
Yes,
I'm
please.
listening, and I would like to ask or at least say a couple of things. So first of all, thank you, Blair, for the sharing that you've done. One of the things that my mom said to me at one time was that the medicines that the trees that grow on our land now are trees that have come from other countries and no longer carry the medicines that we need in order for us to heal ourselves. So that was one thing. And I remember when she said that, I was thinking, one of those, oh, come on, mom, but now I understand a little bit better what that means. The other thing is I missed the first half of this talk. And so I was wanting to ask about, I know you talked a little bit about protocol, but I've always believed that knowledge about protocol and learning how to do protocol insofar as gathering and harvesting and planting is something that everyone really should know how to practice, because I really feel that if we don't practice that, then we continue to be what we believe as, and I hope I can say this at this time of year, but where we become we tukuak, like we're so much into consumerism, we don't know when to stop.
Yep.
Anyways, I was thinking about that as you're speaking, Blair. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Linda. I appreciate that. One of the fundamental purposes of ceremonies was to remind us about who we are as spiritual beings and to remind us about our spiritual responsibility. And so, yeah, it's true. If you have a meeting and you don't have that ceremony or that prayer, then basically what you're talking about is, well, how can we make a proposal for more funding from the government, right? Or what government agencies can we get involved in this project, right? So there's really zero reference to anything spiritual or any sort of concept of respect for the environment and stuff like that. Which sure, you can say, well, we respect the environment, we have ecologists and stuff like that, but it's a different level to, for example, recognize that other created things are spiritual beings with the spirit of their own and all that type of thing, right? So it's a whole different level acknowledging a relationship with the environment you're dealing with. The other point about these plants and animals which came here, I know that in traditional times, people developed these spiritual relationships with the plants and animals that were in their lands, and they did that through a lot of prayer and ceremony and that type of thing. And so that's how they developed a relationship, and they were able to use those plants and animals. But so I think the point there is that when you introduce something from some other land, it's kind of been introduced without a spiritual sort of purpose, right? It's either decorative or maybe, like for whatever reason it was brought in for some sort of commercial reason. And so, there's that spiritual aspect that's missing, but it doesn't mean that it can't be developed. And one example I point to is, for example, the horse, right? The horse was introduced, and people developed ceremonies with that, right? They had horse ceremonies and stuff like that, horse dance ceremonies. So, but I think your fundamental point is that the spiritual relationships between people and their environment was very specific, right? In terms of the plants and animals that were brought in, and now people kind of bring in plants and animals sort of ad hoc, and there is no sort of spiritual consideration or brought into that. And I say that's what happens when you have when you don't have a spiritual relationship with the land, right? You just kind of do it willy-nilly according to whatever money or whatever you can do. And so that kind of thing generally doesn't end well, right? It takes away from that spiritual relationship with the land and respect for the beings that are on it.
Great, thank you. Branimir, you have your hand up.
Thank you. That was very fast turn. I would just like to ask a question that connects to your way of developing the understanding. I'm immigrant, and I have a hard time kind of fitting perfectly into that Western culture. And what you're telling me is relatively similar to my culture, which is a bit newer, only maybe 1,600 years, something like that, when we were exposed to Christianity. What I notice similarity between, let's say, North American indigenous cultures and my culture is the knowledge gained through observation and understanding of processes in nature. To be able to maybe come back to better understanding, do you think we should try to get the population, non-indigenous population, to experience a stronger connection to the natural world, slow down and look at the natural world and try to understanding? Maybe that way reach some kind of connection to the higher level of spirituality, rather than kind of run and gun running what we're doing every day right now in, again, quotes, Western cultures.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So one of the things I point out to people is that it doesn't matter where you come from in the world, the people in your area would have been originally indigenous. And to varying degrees in different parts of the world, people have lost connections with their indigenous roots, but there are still indigenous peoples in areas, for example, in places like, the Middle East, for example, there's like a Tangrist tradition. There's the Dalits in India. There's the Taoists in China. And so there are remnants yet of those indigenous populations, but they've been, more or less sidelined by the modern economy and way of doing things. But yeah, for sure, I think that there should be efforts, I think, in all of these countries with people to try and bring people back in touch with not only their indigenous roots, but also in terms of culture and the value of respecting and returning to nature, having a respectful connection with nature, and a connection which assists with like with their own existence as human beings. So, yeah, that's one of the things that I know in classes we teach. I tell students, because we have a lot of international students that come from all over, and they sort of wonder, well, why should I take Indigenous studies? And that's one of the things I tell them, like, it doesn't matter where you come from. People in wherever you came from were originally Indigenous and had, very much the same values that we have as Indigenous peoples here. And there have been various degrees of disconnection in different parts of the world with the Indigenous, the original Indigenous ways. And I think it is. I mean, that's what I say in my book, Challenge to Civilization. I say it's not only important. I think it'd be critical for the future for people all over the world to seriously start taking a look at their own backgrounds. I mean, like I say, a lot of people, when you go to university, a lot of people will simply start at the point of civilization and saying, oh, when did we start, controlling things and building these, architectural places and urban centers and creating all kinds of, things which are commonly associated with civilization. And I say, why don't we go further than that? Why don't we value, the original connection and, very sacred and respectful ways and humble ways that Indigenous peoples had, way back, thousands of years ago, right?
Yes,
So that would include connection with nature, right?
yes. Yeah, and I think that disconnection from nature has been, well, there's been lots of things that have been detrimental, to say the least, but having no understanding of how we're part of nature and not at the top of a pyramid, meaning to master and control, nature, I think is, yeah.
Yeah, one thing I would add is, and I talk about in my books, we also have a very different and long-standing explanation of our origins, right? Like the thing that you're taught in university is that we are evolutionary products of some biological soup, and most recently, of course, we're kind of like intelligent apes, right? And like the great studies, including one done by a United Nations affiliated thing, which was contributed to by scholars all over the world. It's a 1960 mid-60s study. Basically, the whole premise of that book was that we are evolved from apes, and therefore that's why we're greedy, selfish, violent, all that kind of stuff. You see, that's not an Indigenous theory at all. Our theory is that we are spirit beings who came from the stars, and we occupied these human bodies in order to have a physical experience. And, we have the tools to be decent beings. We are not, mind you, the elders say we have to control these bodies, right? And so, if we don't control them, well, then I guess that's when we, I guess that's maybe why people think that we're naturally greedy and violent, even though I think that's a disservice to animals too. I think they're better behaved than that, although obviously there is some bad behavior among animals. But they're my understanding is that they're a different learning level than we are. We're supposedly supposed to be a higher form of being, right? But we're kind of not really playing the part very well.
Exactly, and I think we're in charge of how we see everything else, right? And that interpretation, like it's almost like we're projecting the worst aspects of ourselves onto the behavior we're seeing in nature, rather than
we're making choices, and the
Yeah.
products, what comes out is the choices we're making.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, we're at, according to my computer, 1:26, so we're almost to the end of our hour and a half. I just did want to give an opportunity if there was one more question or comment that folks would like to say. And I've been trying to formulate a question, and I haven't quite got there yet, just for all of us as we go away from today's today's meeting or gathering just about, there's something about, like, it's almost like the genealogy of, I don't know if that's the right word, of the policies, or like in our workplaces and the work that we're doing, like keep asking the why and the why and the why, like keep and going back and back and back until you know, you can kind of make visible what we're just assuming is the way it is.
Yep.
And that's probably not articulated very well, but, you know, I would encourage every, you know, and that's what I'm trying to do. And what I continue to try to do is like understand, have a better understanding of how we got here so that we can do it differently, or,
Yeah.
you know, make choices to do it differently.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, you know, the system has been brought over by Europeans, right? And it's been imposed on us. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the best or proper system. It's a system that's really been geared to, you know, it's an I would describe it as an unspiritual system that's been geared for, you know, like sort of like the quickest and most extensive exploitation of the environment possible, right? And that's not an ideology that as Indigenous peoples we would condone, or that we would believe would lead us to long-term sustainability.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe we'll leave it with that thought, because I think it sort of brings us full circle to the beginning of our conversation today. So again, you know, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your knowledge so generously with us. Thank you to everybody on the call who listened and made comments in the chat or spoke out loud. Appreciate you also taking the time to be here, and would encourage you to maybe to ask the why and again and again and again until you find that root. Yeah, and maybe then ask why again. I don't know. So thank you again. And we will have one more in our series of conversations on July the 3rd. And Allison Squires and Cody Straza, who are organic regenerative farmers, Upland Organics, we're going to be talking about technological innovation from a slightly different perspective in the farming world. So I hope you can be here for that as well. So again, thank you, and we'll close the session.
Yeah, good to be with you all. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.